Hello and Assalamu alaikum everyone and welcome to the last call. Today we have with us one of Pakistan's leading minds on the world of climate policy. He's a great voice, he's a strong voice and he's a great orator and it's an absolute pleasure to have him. His name is Rafi Alam. Before I hand it over to him, I'd like to give a brief introduction to the audience of who Rafi is and what he's been up to over the last couple of years. Rafi is an environmental lawyer, policy expert and a leading commentator. He's been at the forefront of shaping conversations around climate governance, accountability, and urban resilience in Pakistan. He has years of experience across law, policy, advocacy, and he's also served in a number of public sector institutions as well as public bodies. He served as a member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council, which, to my mind, is the most high powered governing authority in the country that the Prime Minister himself chairs. He's also been a part of the Punjab Environmental Protection Council. He's had stints at LESCO, the Lahore Electrical Supply Company, as well as the Lahore Waste Management Company, both entities that are extremely relevant to the world of climate governance today. He brings together sharp perspective on ground, with thought leaders, with authority makers, and he's impacting our cities, our economy, and our future. Without further ado, let's get into the conversation and, let's pick his brain on what he thinks is going to happen in the years and days to come. So, Rafi, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm humbled.
Rafi, I'm always a fan of the things you say. They're very upfront, direct, and that's kind of what I hope and expect today in this conversation. So I'll just go dig deep into a question. Actually, something I heard you say a couple of weeks ago during the OICCI conference in Karachi, and you talked about this really interesting aspect that I had never come across, which was the UK's national security agencies flagged something really interesting. They've talked about the collapse on the global ecosystems. I think that's a very interesting statement to have been made. It's also a very bleak statement to my mind. So if you could just unpack that for us, just talk us through what's happening around the globe and why the UK NSA is kind of worried.
Well, yes, I'd mentioned this report published by the UK government. It's an assessment by its intelligence agencies of the risk climate change poses to British interests, not only within the country, but around the world as well. And in its analysis, it talks about how global ecosystems are very near collapse. All of the major global ecosystems, you've got the tundra forest in North America, the Siberian forest, the Amazon rainforest, the third pole, which are the glaciers and the Himalayas, Karakoram and Hindu Kush mountain ranges, and many more, and how they're facing imminent collapse unless something drastic is done by climate change. I thought it would be interesting to point this out to an audience in Karachi because we tend to forget the severity of the climate crisis we're in right now. And I thought it would be important to remind audience members that, a very serious intelligence report for the British government says that its interests globally and within the country will and are going to be compromised by the pressing climate crisis. It's an eye-opener, and it should be the reason why we talk about this in the media as a first and foremost subject.
I think it's great to see one of the developed nations and their security apparatus saying all of this, because that kind of goes really into the heart of the fact that it is everyone's going to get impacted. There's no running away from this. So I know you've been a part of a number of global forums, such as the COP. Of course, there's been the UNFCCC's adoption in 1992. So what do you think from, just taking on the early conversation of the UK agency saying XYZ, where do you see the developed countries playing a role? How do you think there's been a shortfall on their end? And how do you think that, the whole cohesion map has to come together with the developed and the developing?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to understand the very basic architecture of international climate law. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992's objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions so that there isn't any dangerous man-made interference in the global ecosystem. And in order to fulfill this promise, developed countries, rich countries, are under a commitment to reduce their greenhouse gases, to mitigate them, and also provide climate finance to less developed countries so that they can prepare for the impacts of climate change. These are the implicit promises of the UNFCCC system, especially on developed countries. But the truth is that there has been no stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. I mean, one way we measure greenhouse gas emission concentrations is by looking at the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. When I was born, the carbon concentration was about 333 particles per million. And when the UNFCCC was signed, I think it was about 350, 360. Right now, the carbon concentration is well over 420 parts per million and shows no sign of slowing down. And what this means is that one of the major commitments of developed countries, that is to mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions, has not been done. We see greenhouse gas emissions rising every single year. As a matter of fact, we are now beyond the emissions levels before the pandemic. So there's been no stabilization, and that's a huge broken promise. As a consequence thereof, countries like Pakistan, facing the brunt of the climate change, don't have the necessary finances to be able to protect themselves, which brings me to the other failure of the international community, especially the developed world, is the lack of climate finance, the absolute lack of climate finance. In 2010, the G20 promised $100 billion in climate finance, and of that, about $15-16 billion has actually been capitalized. Whereas when it comes to war in Ukraine or in Israel, one country, the United States, in 2024 granted $95 billion for war. So yes, there are massive failures on the international community, on their commitments, on the climate, on climate pledges, and countries like Pakistan and people like Pakistanis are paying the price for it.
I'm a big fan of this last statement of war being so easy to spend money on. You see Ukraine, now you see Iran. Trump came out yesterday talking about Medicare and how national insurance has to go out the window just to fund the war that has been started out of nothing. And I think there's a serious gap and problem in terms of the international incentive alignment, where we're so comfortable spending so much money on some matters and so stingy on others. And I think climate finance is unfortunately been one of those pockets where the developed nations have not been as open-hearted as you would expect of them or hope of them. And especially with the evolving global order now, I think it's only going to become a much harder conversation with possible impending recessions and interest rates going up. I actually don't know where this will go, and that kind of wants me to go into this whole larger discussion about climate diplomacy and how to rebuild from there on in. Rafi, just kind of continuing on the evolving global landscape, the order, the war diplomacy and whatnot. I just want to kind of link this to this really important element, which is to find climate diplomacy. How do you see, with the evolving international landscape, how do you see climate diplomacy playing a role for the deployment of capital, and how important do you think this really is?
Well, climate diplomacy revolves around the UN system. It's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the main international document, legal document on how the world is going to deal with climate change. And under this, things like the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, the Cancun Agreement, the Sharm el-Sheikh Loss and Damage Fund have all evolved from this one agreement. And it all is based on the UN system, where every country has a single vote and all decisions have to be made by consensus. And it is this format, which is climate diplomacy, which faces the challenge of overcoming climate change. I've already mentioned that the UNFCCC's sole objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, which it hasn't done. And I'm reminded of one of my mentors, Dr. Adil Najam, saying that if the Conference of Parties, which is the signatories of the UNFCCC, haven't been able to do a stabilization in 28 or 29 meetings, it's hardly likely they're going to do something in the next one. And this pessimism is carried forward amongst a lot of people because climate diplomacy is the only chance we have. The UN is the only game we have to fix climate change, and it's severely compromised. It's severely compromised in the way it's started up and it's shaped, and now it's being more compromised by its inability to deal with a genocide in Gaza. I mean, in many ways, the climate crisis is a civilizational crisis. And as temperatures rise, heat waves are going to make food short and heat waves exacerbate. And we're going to see millions of people who die. And if the UN framework can't fix a genocide in Gaza, I am very concerned how climate diplomacy can fix something like climate change at the global level at scale. So, yes, there are extreme challenges to climate diplomacy, but I remain an optimist because this is the only way we can fix it.
I think I think you're very right, and I am one of those pessimists who's been to some of these conferences, seen a lot of jargon thrown out, and not seen a lot of quantifiable results. And frankly speaking, the amount of money, resource, time that goes in on a global scale at one of these conference parties is also phenomenal. And given how we see, especially, I think the UN's really lost its backbone with Gaza, and now with the Iran war, you also see that they're really unable to do anything. So I'm very pessimistic in terms of what the UNFCCC as a sub-arm will be able to achieve when the developed nations don't want something. But in an ideal world, let's try to be a little rosy about what might happen in the next few years, how a systemic shift might come. What do you think fundamentally needs to change at the global landscape or the COP level or the UNFCCC level for actually this sentiment to change, or these forums to actually become meaningful areas of conversation for impact in the future?
Well, first of all, there is no such thing as a safe amount of climate change. We have changed our climate, but this is no longer the planet you and I were born in. Temperatures no longer depend on averages. We are now in a world of extremes. And this is going to continue for centuries until we can manage to get carbon out of the atmosphere to a level what it was before the Industrial Revolution. And really, what we need to do going forward is to disassemble the drivers of climate change. In many ways, climate change is not a problem. Climate change is a symptom of human overconsumption of resources on Earth. And we've got to address our economy, which prioritizes profit over the accountability of the consumption of resources and human labor. We have to address colonialism and imperialism in our economic markets. We have to address the consumerism that we have, because these are the drivers of the climate crisis. And I think these are the things that we need to realize at the global scale, how we need a new morality in this different world that we're going to see evolving in the future, if we have any hope as a society to continue.
Very, very right, to be honest. But having said that, do you think that we're too late to the party to react, or do you think there's some specific elements of urgency that can really change the direction we're headed in right now?
Well, yes. I mean, there are a million ways of phasing out fuel. But the problem is some of the largest companies on earth, I talk about Saudi Aramco, for example, in 2022, the year Pakistan suffered about $40 billion in loss because of a flood, Saudi Aramco posted a profit of $161 billion, 4 times the amount of money Pakistan's infrastructure and people lost in 1 year as profit. And this is the global economic system that we live in. And so what we need to do is we need to unend this by changing our habits and morality. The immense amount of fuel that's required around the world for energy and transport often just supports a global consumerist lifestyle that doesn't need to exist. Think about the large economies in the world, the US, for example, where these huge, big gas guzzling SUVs have become the norm when it should be public transport. And this is endemic throughout the world as well. And so, similarly, society will have to change its morality and shift from these sorts of practices that have a high greenhouse gas emission to something that's more sustainable. It might not look modern, you might not like it, but the hard limits that climate change are putting on economic activity in the world going forward will necessitate changes in human beings. We're going to have to change our morality, like I said, the way our economics works and our consumerism works. It's going to be a very different world. And we have to start now beginning to envision how it's going to be.
Yeah, I think that point really speaks to the fact that when a lot of people ask this very baseline question, what can I do as an individual? I don't have the policy decision making power, or I'm not the head of an institution that I can really enact change. And I think this is the key in terms of what you're saying. every single individual has to make some level of change in their life. It could be in the form of carpooling, it could be in the form of using different types of packaging, it could be in the form of being more sustainable with your water, literally brushing your teeth. There's a number of factors, but I think, all of us need to have a moral responsibility inside of us to, take it further. Rafi, now I'd kind of want to possibly jump into some of the more national Pakistan lens elements that you've been working on so deeply and so greatly. I think your leadership and involvement, most historically in the Lahore Bachao movement, has been a defining feature for climate action in the country, in the province for sure. So, from a lens of someone who's actually done it from the ground up, especially when climate finance or climate change was not really a hot topic in this country or as much globally. How do you feel that such movements can come back to life? Because we've seen of late that they've kind of died down. And how do you see these movements exerting pressure on the corridors of power to really achieve the aims we need to with the climate action needed?
Well, well, thank you for reminding me of Lahore Bachao, which was about 20 years ago, I tell you. I'm reminded here by another great guide in my life, the late Ardeshir Kausji, the columnist, who once wrote that activism is not about winning, it's about the fight itself. And whilst the first Lahore Bachao campaign started in 2005 and concluded in 2012 with the Supreme Court authorizing a limited widening of the Lahore Canal Road, the civil society elements of Lahore Bachao still persist. There are constructions going on as of last year that have been challenged by Lahore Bachao. There was a park here that's being converted into a public park being converted into a parking plaza, which was challenged. People came out in numbers. We went to court and so on and so forth. So I think one of the important elements of activism is having an articulate civil society. And that means meeting and conversing with people and sharing ideas, nothing more than that. And it really comes from that. People everywhere I've gone in Pakistan really love their dharti, love their soil, love the cities that they are in, love the country they're in, love the earth that they're on, and all want to be part of a larger, more meaningful sort of path in their life. And so connecting them together and raising their voice anywhere in Pakistan shouldn't be a challenge. And I'm kind of pleased that there is civil society wherever I see it. I mean, a few days ago, there's what is it? An avenue in Karachi that's threatened to be widened, and there's going to be trees cutting down. And I'm heartened to see that just today, the citizens of Islamabad have filed a contempt petition against the CDA for doing so. So it's this sort of lifeblood in your heart that you need to have as an individual that will keep civil society flowing. Because there's one thing I believe, that it's always been a handful of very passionate people that have changed the world. And so I invite everyone else to, engage and articulate their passions and become the change that they need to be.
I think an interesting element, not being political about this, but just trying to be as objective as possible, is when Lahore Bachao came to life, or in the years after that, in the next, let's say in the last decade or so, we also saw judicial activism really take life in this country. And I think in the last year or two, we've really seen a lot of that, I think, mellow down, for a lack of better phrase. How do you see the civil society kind of putting things into action with a judiciary that is not as activated anymore? What is the pathway you would give to the younger lot who would want to do what you did 20 years ago?
Well, upgrading the refineries is expensive. And so, under the last petroleum policy that I think, or the petroleum refinery policy that was notified by the government, I think in 2023 or early 24, I'm not sure, allows our 4 or 5 refineries to collect a cess on the sale of their products, from which they will eventually have a sum of money large enough in the next 5 years to be able to invest in upgrading their refineries so that they're producing not just what they're doing right now is barely Euro 2, but to be able to produce up to Euro 4 or Euro 5. And if that works, it's going to take time and money, but if that works, that's half of your air pollution issue resolved in Punjab in a stroke. So there are big steps that can be taken with with these sorts of measures, but none of these measures when it comes to environmental pollution or climate change are overnight. solutions, or nor are they cheap solutions. And so in these circumstances, what you need to have is a civil society voice that's articulate and longer and more sustainable in the 5-year election cycle, because so many of these projects and things that need to be done will take 10, 15 years to mature. And we need to have a consistent civil society voice asking them to be implemented before we see any results.
I think that's a really important element, the consistency part of it. So Rafi, a question for you is how do you assess the feasibility of development projects across the country? What do you think is going to be most beneficial in the long run, such as building public transport networks, such as the refinery that you've mentioned? What are the few things that come to your mind in terms of things that should be on the top of the agenda for the government going forward?
That's very broad, because addressing climate change means changing the way we live, changing our own morality. So everything has to change. So all sorts of development projects can be sort of assessed over here. But of course, we need public transport. Of course, we need to upgrade those refineries. Of course, we need to have better flood protections, especially in the mountainous areas. Of course, we have to have better flood forecasting. We have to have also, very importantly and very sensitively, better heat preparedness in our urban areas. I'm very concerned about how, as global warming increases, our urban areas, and remember, more than 50% of Pakistanis live in urban areas, are going to be exposed to heat that their bodies won't be able to deal with unless they have access to climate control. And I'm very concerned in the future how the right to energy will become a fundamental right for people who need to survive, basically survive in our cities, and prevent death from heat wave. So there's much to be done. And really, you don't have to ask me what needs to be done. I'm only merely mentioning things that I've read from our various climate policies, food security policies, agriculture policies, water policies, sustainable development policies, both at the federal level and the provincial level, air pollution policies, all have these things written down. They have all been, we know what we need to do. It's been written down in black and white, except it's not going to be overnight, and it's not going to be cheap, and it's going to take political leadership and vision driven by a very vocal civil society.
Fair enough. I think kind of leading on to that from the development side of this is obviously what you've talked about, the leadership side of it, and of course the civil society has a role to play in all of this. But from a climate governance lens, right? And I know because you work with the federation, you work with the provinces, you worked across the private sector, the civil society. How do you feel that we can build a more cohesive structure with transparency, accountability, and most importantly, efficiency at its core?
Um, well, I wouldn't put things like transparency. I mean, of course, there should be transparency and accountability, but there needs to be good governance to begin with. And once there's good governance, it has all of these elements in it. They came at the federal level. When you think about climate initiatives, the way our constitution is set out, most climate related governance issues are matters of provincial responsibility. Things like flood protection, agricultural protection, forests, livestock, urban transport, public transport, all of this urban development is all local, is all provincial government. The federal government does have a role in climate change. Most importantly, it is to coordinate with the United Nations. And what we have seen in the last 10 years is the federal government evolve a climate policy, and for the first time the provinces also adopt their own provincial climate policy. So I think what we need going forward is a much stronger coordination between the provinces and the federation about what their needs are, because our previous national or federal climate policy doesn't really take into the account the various climate contexts and nuanced differences between the provinces. For example, Sindh and Balochistan have coastlines. It's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa that has the forests and the mountains. And so these differing contexts require climate governance to be evolved from the bottom up, preferably from the provinces to the federation, and in the best case scenario, from local governments through the provinces to the federation. And so really looking forward, I'd like to see that sort of structure emerge where there's clear-cut communication and coordination at all levels when it comes to climate change and governance in Pakistan.
I think I've also kind of my favorite buzzword is that we operate in silos, and I think it's a federal versus provincial problem, and then within the province there's also this weird problem where there's PND, there's EPA, there's finance, there's the CM office, and it's really hard to actually get something through. And to my surprise is also the fact that the Punjab government alone had a multi-billion-dollar loan book that was in some way or form related to climate financing, ADB, World Bank, a number of other entities that have pledged money, but we're also not apparently able to execute the capital that has come in. So my pressing question to you is, because you've been a part of these conversations very much, is even if we are hypothetically able to get financing in the door, it seems as though we are not able to spend it or allocate the capital efficiently. What do you think that needs to change in that respect?
Well, again, like I said, a lot of the financing has come to the federal government, but it's more recent that the provincial governments have their climate policies in place and will be able to secure climate financing themselves. One of the difficulties with the federal government doing things like ibex protection in the mountains or snow leopard protection in the mountains or glacier lake outburst floods is that this is really a provincial management issues. I think going forward, let's see the capacity of the provinces to be able to consume climate finance in areas that it thinks is important, stuff that's really important and within their realm of governance. So, I do take your point that we've had a problem consuming the finances that we've been given, but really we've been giving them to the wrong tier of government. I hope that moving forward with this better coordinated structure between the federation and the provinces, these sorts of finances can be obtained and consumed for the benefit of the people in areas that need them most.
I think with that, Rafi, I'm going to have to request a closure to this, but it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. We've learned a great deal from managing government to the roles of the national and multinational bodies, what the UN is doing, how we see the global order evolving, and generally the really strong role that the civil society has played in the past and must continue to play in the future for Pakistan to become a climate resilient country. So with that, thank you so much, Rafi, for being here. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching the last call.